The ledger was open between them, its columns neat and unremarkable, when Benedict Hale, Duke of Ashwick, said the words that would, in time, become the most inaccurate prediction ever uttered within the walls of his own study. She will not last a month. He did not say it with malice. That was the thing Cavender would remember later when the phrase had calcified into something almost comic. The Duke had not been cruel. He had been indifferent, which was worse. He had spoken of his new wife the way a man speaks of an inconvenient tenancy arrangement or a horse-purchased site unseen at auction. A fact to be disposed of, a temporary condition. Cavender, who had served as steward of Ashwick Hall for 11 years and who knew the Duke's moods the way a sailor knows weather, said nothing. He adjusted the angle of the ledger. He dipped his pen. He waited. "She is a merchant's daughter," Benedict continued, as though this explained everything. "Corbin's girl. The settlement was generous, and the family insisted on the match. Something about a maternal connection to the Hale line, 3 generations removed. My solicitor assures me it is legitimate." He turned toward the window, where February light fell thin and gray across the parkland. "She will find the house cold, the county dull, and my company inadequate. She will retreat to London by Easter." "Very good, Your Grace," Cavender said, because there was nothing else to say when the Duke of Ashwick had made up his mind about something. The steward recorded the date of the marriage settlement in the margin of the estate accounts, the 4th of February, 1814, and turned the page. Flora Corbin arrived at Ashwick Hall on the 9th of February in a hired carriage with 2 trunks, a hat-box, and no lady's maid. Mrs. Selwyn, the housekeeper, met her at the servants' entrance because no one had thought to open the front doors, and Flora did not ask why. She stepped down from the carriage, looked up at the house, its gray stone front, its rows of dark windows, its resolute lack of welcome, and said, "What a handsome chimney arrangement! Are all the hearths drawing well?" Mrs. Selwyn, who had prepared herself for tears or for the brittle brightness that unhappy brides sometimes wore like armor, found herself answering honestly. "The east wing smokes when the wind comes off the hill, ma'am. It has done for years." "Then we shall start there," Flora said, and walked inside as though she had been expected. She had not been expected. Benedict was in London for the sitting of the House of Lords, a session on corn duties that would keep him occupied for the better part of 3 weeks, and had left no instructions regarding his wife's arrival beyond a single line in a letter to Cavender. "See that she has a room." Cavender had seen to it. The room was adequate. It was also the smallest bedchamber on the first floor, facing north, with curtains that smelled of camphor and a mattress that had not been turned since the previous autumn. Flora surveyed it without complaint. She opened the window despite the cold, stripped the bed herself, and asked Mrs. Selwyn where the linen cupboard was kept. By noon, she had remade the bed with fresh sheets, arranged her 2 trunks against the wall, and found her way to the kitchen, where she sat at the long oak table and ate bread and cold ham with the cook, a woman named Mrs. Selwyn's sister, though everyone called her Nan, who had not spoken to a member of the family in 4 years and did not know what to make of a duchess who buttered her own bread. The household watched her the way animals watch a new creature introduced to their territory, with stillness and calculation. She was not what they had expected. She was not what anyone had expected. She was small and plain and direct, with dark hair that she pinned without fashion and hands that moved with the efficiency of someone who had grown up in a house where idleness was not admired. She did not ring bells. She appeared in doorways. She asked questions, not the imperious questions of a new mistress establishing dominance, but the practical questions of someone who genuinely wished to understand how the house worked. "How often is the silver cleaned? Where does the water come from when the well drops in summer? Has anyone looked at the damp in the cellar passage, or has it simply been there so long that everyone has agreed to ignore it?" Mrs. Selwyn, who had served 3 duchesses and buried 2 of them, found herself answering these questions with a thoroughness she had not offered anyone in years. There was something about Flora Hale, she was Flora Hale now, though the name still sat strangely on her, that made directness feel not just possible, but necessary. She did not perform authority. She simply occupied space with a quiet competence that made performance unnecessary. Benedict returned from London on the 27th of February. He found his study fire lit, his correspondence sorted by date on the desk, and a small pot of snowdrops on the windowsill that had not been there when he left. He removed the snowdrops and rang for Cavender. "How is she settling?" he asked in the tone of a man inquiring after a new fence post. "The Duchess has been quite occupied, Your Grace." "Occupied with what?" Cavender hesitated. This was unusual for him. "She has addressed the smoking chimneys in the East Wing. She engaged the sweep from the village and supervised the work herself, through Mrs. Selwyn, of course. She has also reviewed the household accounts with Mrs. Selwyn and identified several economies that I confess I had overlooked." Benedict looked up. "She reviewed the accounts." "She asked to see them, Your Grace. I saw no reason to refuse." "And the economies?" "The chandler in Hartwell has been overcharging for tallow candles by 3 pence per dozen since Michaelmas. The Duchess, Mrs. Hale, noticed the discrepancy in the first quarter's figures." Cavender paused. "She has written to the chandler directly, through Mrs. Selwyn." Benedict stared at his steward for a long moment. Then he said, "See that she has a larger room," and turned back to his correspondence. He did not see her that evening. He did not seek her out. He dined alone in the dining room, while Flora ate in the small parlor adjacent to the kitchen, as she had done every night since her arrival. The staff moved between them like currents in a river divided by a stone, aware of both banks, belonging to neither, though increasingly, and without anyone marking the exact moment of the shift, flowing more naturally toward one side than the other. March came wet and cold. Benedict left again for London. The lords were debating poor relief, and his attendance was expected, and the house settled into the rhythm that Flora had, without announcement or ceremony, established. She rose early. She walked the ground floor before breakfast, checking hearths and windows and the particular creak in the third step of the servant's stair that she had asked the estate carpenter to examine. She took breakfast in the kitchen with Nan. She met with Mrs. Selwyn at 9 o'clock in the housekeeper's sitting room, where the two women reviewed the day's requirements with a briskness that Mrs. Selwyn had not experienced since the old Duchess, Benedict's mother, had died 6 years earlier. It was Mrs. Selwyn who first used the word. She said it to Nan in the kitchen over tea on a Tuesday afternoon when rain was hammering the windows and Flora was upstairs writing letters to 3 tradesmen who had submitted irregular invoices. "She runs the house," Mrs. Selwyn said. "I do not mean she interferes with it. I mean she runs it the way his mother did." Nan, who expressed opinions through silence and bread dough, punched down a loaf and said nothing, which Mrs. Selwyn understood as agreement. The first time Cavender brought an estate matter to Flora was the 14th of March. He did not plan it. He had been walking to Benedict's study to leave a note regarding a boundary dispute between 2 tenant farmers, Mr. Goss and his neighbor Pickering, when he passed the morning room and saw Flora at the writing desk, spectacles on, reviewing what appeared to be a map of the estate's drainage channels. "Cavender," she said without looking up, "is there a reason the north field drains into Mr. Goss's lower pasture rather than into the ditch that runs along the Hartwell Road?" He stopped in the doorway. "The ditch silted up 4 years ago, ma'am. The cost of clearing it was deemed excessive." "Deemed excessive by whom?" "By His Grace." Flora removed her spectacles and looked at him. She had a way of looking at people that was neither challenging nor submissive. It was simply attentive, in the manner of someone who intended to understand the answer fully before responding. "What would it cost to clear it now?" £8, perhaps 9. The silt is compounded." "And what has Mr. Goss lost in flooded pasture over 4 years?" Cavender opened his mouth. He closed it. He had not calculated this. He realized, with a sensation that was not quite embarrassment but was certainly adjacent to it, that he should have. "I will find out, ma'am." "Thank you, Cavender. And the boundary dispute, is that what you have there?" She nodded toward the papers in his hand. He looked down at them. "It is, ma'am. I was going to leave a note for His Grace." "His Grace is in London until the end of the month. May I see it?" He gave her the papers. She read them in his presence, asked 2 questions, both precise, both relevant, and suggested a resolution that involved neither legal action nor the Duke's intervention, but rather a shared access agreement for the disputed hedgerow that would cost nothing and offend no one. Cavender implemented it the following day. Mr. Goss, who had been feuding with Pickering for 18 months and had twice written to the Duke without receiving a reply, came to the kitchen door of Ashwick Hall the following week with a basket of early radishes and a request to thank the Duchess personally. Flora accepted the radishes. She did not mention that she had resolved the dispute. She asked after Mr. Goss's wife, who had been ill with a cough since January, and suggested a preparation of honey and thyme that her own mother had used in the shop, for Flora's father had been a merchant of spices and remedies, and she had grown up surrounded by the practical knowledge of what healed and what did not. Mr. Goss left Ashwick Hall that afternoon and told his wife that the new Duchess was not what he had expected. His wife asked what he had expected. He could not quite say. Something grander, perhaps, something less useful. There were other moments, smaller ones, that the household collected the way a river collects stones, not deliberately, but inevitably, through the steady current of days. Flora discovered that the still room had not been restocked since the previous autumn and spent a morning with Mrs. Selwyn cataloging what was needed. Dried lavender for the linen presses, beeswax for the furniture, camphor for the winter woolens that would need storing by May. She wrote the orders herself, in a clear merchant's hand that betrayed her upbringing, and the suppliers in Hartwell began addressing their invoices to the Duchess of Ashwick without anyone instructing them to do so. She found the library locked one afternoon and asked Mrs. Selwyn for the key. No one had used the library in years. Benedict read in his study, and the old Duchess had preferred the morning room. Flora opened the curtains, which released a cloud of dust that made her sneeze 3 times in rapid succession, and spent the remainder of the day pulling books from shelves, checking for damp damage, and reorganizing the collection by subject rather than by the haphazard arrangement that had prevailed since Benedict's father's time. She did not ask permission. She did not announce her intentions. She simply did it. And when Mrs. Selwyn passed the library that evening and saw the candles lit and the curtains open and the books arranged with small paper markers indicating their categories, she stood in the doorway for a long moment and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that the room itself did not already express. The gardener, a man named Brew, who had tended the grounds for 30 years and who communicated primarily through grunts and the strategic placement of wheelbarrows, brought Flora a cutting of a winter jasmine one morning and left it on the kitchen step without a word. Flora planted it beneath the morning room window. It would not bloom until the following winter, but the act of planting it, of placing something in the ground that would not yield its purpose for months, was, in its quiet way, a declaration. She was not leaving. She was putting down roots, literally, in soil that no one had asked her to tend. By April, the pattern had set. Cavender no longer left notes in the Duke's study when Benedict was absent. He brought matters to Flora, not all matters, not the legal complexities or the parliamentary correspondence, but the practical business of an estate with 14 tenancies, a home farm, 3 cottages in need of repair, and a staff of 19 who had operated without clear direction for the better part of 6 years. Flora dealt with each matter the same way. She listened, she asked questions, she suggested a course of action, and she deferred to Cavender's expertise on anything that required knowledge she did not possess. She never overstepped. She never presumed. She simply filled the space that had been empty. The staff noticed. Of course they noticed. The footman, James, began addressing her as Your Grace rather than Ma'am, a small shift, but one that Mrs. Selwyn registered and did not correct. The housemaid stopped falling silent when she entered a room. Nan began setting a place for her at the kitchen table without being asked, and on Easter Sunday, she baked a cake with sugared violets on top and left it outside Flora's door with a note that read, in Nan's emphatic hand, for the Duchess. Benedict returned from London on the 4th of April. He had been away for 5 weeks. He entered the house through the front door, which was open because Flora had instructed that it be opened whenever the weather was fine, a practice that had lapsed after the old Duchess's death, and found the entrance hall bright with spring light and smelling of beeswax and lavender. Something had changed. He could not identify it immediately. The house was the same house, the same stone floors, the same portraits on the staircase wall, the same view of the park through the tall windows. But it felt different. It felt, and he resisted this word even as it formed, inhabited. He found Cavender in the estate office, not the Duke's study, but the smaller room adjacent to it where the steward kept his own records. Cavender rose when Benedict entered. Your Grace, welcome home. What has happened to the house? Cavender blinked. Happened, Your Grace? It is different. The Duchess has made some adjustments to the household management, Your Grace. With Mrs. Selwyn's assistance, I can provide a summary if... I do not need a summary. I need to know why my entrance hall smells like a garden. Beeswax and lavender, Your Grace. The Duchess introduced it to the polishing regime. The previous mixture was turpentine-based and rather... Fine, Benedict waved a hand. And the chimneys? Repaired, Your Grace, all drawing cleanly, including the east wing. The drainage dispute? Resolved, Your Grace. Mrs. Hale, the Duchess, suggested a shared access agreement. Both tenants are satisfied. Benedict sat down in the chair opposite Cavender's desk. This was unusual. Benedict did not sit in Cavender's office. Cavender stood in Benedict's study. The reversal was small, but it was, to Cavender, seismic. "She has been busy," Benedict said. "She has, Your Grace." "And you have been, what? Assisting her?" Cavender chose his next words with the care of a man walking across a frozen pond. "I have been performing my duties as steward, Your Grace. The Duchess has been a helpful presence in matters where the household and the estate intersect." Benedict looked at him. Cavender looked back. In 11 years of service, the two men had developed a fluency in silence that made most conversation unnecessary. But this silence was different. It carried something new, not accusation, not displeasure, but the faint, uncomfortable vibration of a man discovering that a structure he had believed to be stable had, in fact, been rearranged while he was looking the other way. "I should like to dine with my wife this evening," Benedict said, "in the dining room." "Very good, Your Grace. I shall inform Mrs. Selwyn." They dined together that evening for the first time. Flora wore a gray muslin dress with a cream spencer, her hair pinned simply, no jewelry except a thin gold chain that had been her mother's. She sat at the opposite end of the long dining table and ate roast mutton and spring greens with the composure of a woman who had been dining alone for 2 months and had no particular need for company, but was not opposed to it either. Benedict watched her across 14 feet of polished mahogany and felt, for the first time, the particular discomfort of being studied without being watched. Flora was not observing him. She was simply present, attentive to her food, to the quality of the candles, to the temperature of the room, and her lack of attention to him was, paradoxically, the most attentive thing anyone had done in his presence for years. She was not performing. She was not anxious. She was not trying to be liked. "The chimneys," he said, because he could not think of anything else. "They needed doing," Flora said. "Mrs. Selwyn mentioned they had been troublesome. For years. Yes, it was only soot and a bird's nest in the east wing. The sweep was competent." Silence. The candles flickered. A log shifted in the hearth. "The radishes," Benedict said. Flora looked up. "I beg your pardon?" There were radishes in the kitchen, early ones, from Goss. "He brought them last week. His wife's cough has improved." "You know about his wife's cough?" "She has had it since January. I suggested thyme and honey." Benedict set down his fork. He looked at this woman, this merchant's daughter, this political inconvenience, this person he had married without meeting and dismissed without knowing. And for the first time, he did not see what she was not. He saw what she was. She was competent. She was present. She was, in the most fundamental and least performative way possible, running his house. "I should like to see the household accounts," he said. "Certainly. I keep them in the morning room. Mrs. Selwyn and I review them weekly." "You review them weekly." "Is that a question, Your Grace?" "It is an observation." "Then yes, weekly, on Tuesdays." He did not know what to do with her. That was the truth of it. He had anticipated a woman who would wilt or retreat or rage. The 3 responses he had observed in every woman who had ever been subjected to the indifference of a Hale. His own mother had raged, brilliantly, expensively, with a fury that had kept the household in a state of permanent tension for 20 years. His father's sister had wilted, retreating to Bath and then to silence, and then to an early grave that no one in the family discussed. Flora did none of these things. She simply continued. She continued the way the house continued, the way the seasons turned over the park, the way the river at the bottom of the estate ran regardless of whether anyone was watching it. He began to watch her, though he would not have called it that. He noticed when she passed his study door the sound of her step, which was quick and light and purposeful, unlike the heavier tread of the servants or the measured pace of Cavender. He noticed when she was absent from the house, walking the grounds, visiting tenants, inspecting the kitchen garden with Bro, because the quality of the silence changed when she was not in it. The house without Flora had a particular hollowness that he had never registered before, because the house had always been hollow, and he had mistaken hollowness for peace. One evening in late April, he came down the staircase and found her in the entrance hall, arranging candles in the sconces with a taper. The light caught her face from below, the line of her jaw, the dark sweep of her hair, the particular concentration she brought to even the smallest task, and he paused on the 3rd step and watched her for a full minute before she noticed him. When she did not startle. She simply looked up, said, "Good evening, Your Grace," and returned to the candles, and he descended the remaining stairs with the uncomfortable awareness that he had been the one caught off guard, not her. May brought warmth, and with it a crisis that would have overwhelmed any other new bride and most experienced stewards. The home farm's roof collapsed after a week of heavy rain, not the entire roof, but the eastern section, which housed the dairy and the grain store. Cavender was in Hartwell on estate business. Benedict was in his study, reading correspondence from his solicitor. It was Flora who heard the crash, Flora who walked to the farm, Flora who assessed the damage with the farm manager and dispatched James the footman to fetch the builder from the village. When Cavender returned that afternoon, the builder was already at work. The dairy stock had been moved to the stable block, and Flora was in the kitchen with Nan, organizing the preservation of the cheese that had been stored in the damaged section. She had flour on her sleeve, and her hair had come partially unpinned, and she was, Cavender noted with the detached precision of a man recording a historic event, giving orders. Not loudly, not imperiously. She was simply telling people what needed to happen next, and they were doing it, because what she said made sense, and because, and this was the part that Cavender would later identify as the exact moment when everything changed, they trusted her. He brought her the builder's estimate that evening. He did not bring it to Benedict. He brought it to Flora. He did not make a conscious decision to do this. He simply walked to the morning room, where she was sitting with a cup of tea and a list of the damaged stock, and laid the paper on her desk. £8 for the timber, ma'am, 12 for the labor. They can begin tomorrow if you approve. She looked at the estimate. She looked at Cavender. She said, "This is an estate matter, Cavender. Should it not go to His Grace?" "It should, ma'am, but His Grace is occupied and the roof will not wait." A beat of silence. Flora signed the estimate. "Inform the builder. And Cavender, check the western section while they are here. The timbers looked suspect to me." "I had the same thought, ma'am." He left. He walked down the corridor toward the estate office and past the Duke's study, where the door was open, and Benedict was standing at the window, looking out at the park. Cavender did not know how long the Duke had been standing there. He did not know if Benedict had heard the exchange. He did not slow his pace. Benedict had heard. He had heard his steward bring an estate matter to his wife, and he had heard his wife handle it with the quiet authority of someone who had been handling things for months. He stood at the window and felt the ground shift beneath a certainty he had carried since February. The certainty that Flora Corbin was a temporary condition, an inconvenience to be endured, a woman who would not last a month. She had lasted 3. She had lasted 3 months, and she had, without confrontation or complaint or a single raised voice, become the person his household turned to. His housekeeper deferred to her. His cook baked for her. His tenants brought her radishes. His steward, the man who had served Benedict for 11 years, who had never once deviated from the chain of authority, brought her the estimates. It wasn't the roof. It was not the chimneys or the drainage ditch or the chandler's overcharge. It was the accumulation, the sheer, quiet, relentless accumulation of competence, of presence, of a woman who did not demand space, but simply occupied it until the space forgot it had ever been empty. He found her that evening in the morning room. She was writing a letter to Mr. Goss's wife, he would later learn, inquiring after the cough. Her spectacles were on. Her hair was still partially unpinned from the morning's crisis. A candle burned low on the desk beside her. "Flora," she looked up. It was the first time he'd used her name. "Your Grace." "Benedict," he said, "if you are to sign my estate's invoices, you might at least call me by my name." A pause. The candlelight moved across her face. "Benedict, I owe you an apology." "For what?" He sat down across from her. He did not know how to say this. He was a man of silences and assumptions, not confessions. But he tried, because she deserved the attempt. "For not seeing you. For assuming that because our marriage was arranged, it was also temporary. For leaving you in the smallest room in the house and expecting you to find your own way out." Flora removed her spectacles. She folded them carefully and placed them on the desk. "I did find my way out," she said. "I found my way into every room in this house eventually." "You did. Was there something specific that prompted this?" He hesitated. Then he said, "Cavender brought you the estimate for the roof." "He did. He should have brought it to me." "Yes. But he brought it to you." "Yes. Because you are the person who handles things. You have been the person who handles things since February, and I was too indifferent to notice." Flora looked at him with the same steady, attentive expression she gave to everything. The household accounts, the drainage maps, Mrs. Goss's cough, the collapsed roof. She looked at him the way she looked at problems, directly, without flinching, with the clear intention of understanding before responding. "You are noticing now," she said. "I am. Then that is enough." It was not a grand reconciliation. There was no tearful embrace, no dramatic declaration, no sweeping gesture that would have rung false in any case against the quiet, practical rhythm that Flora had established. What there was instead was a shift, the same kind of shift that had moved through the household over 3 months, gradual and irreversible, like water finding its level. Benedict reached across the desk and took her hand. It was the first time he had touched her since the wedding ceremony, a brief formal clasp in a cold church that neither of them remembered with any warmth. Her hand was small and ink-stained and warm, and he held it for a moment without speaking, because he was learning, slowly, that the most important things between them happened in silence. "I should like to walk the estate with you tomorrow," he said, "if you would show me what you have done." "It is your estate, Benedict." "It is, but I suspect you know it better than I do at present." She did not deny this. She did not soften it with modesty. She simply said, "Shall we begin at the home farm? The western timbers do need your attention." They walked the estate the following morning. Flora wore a pale blue pelisse and a bonnet that Mrs. Selwyn had pressed for the occasion, though Flora had not asked her to. Benedict walked beside her in his riding coat, hatless, his hands clasped behind his back in the manner of a man being given a tour of his own property by someone who understood it better than he did. She showed him the rebuilt dairy roof, the cleared drainage ditch, the repaired cottages. She introduced him to Mr. Goss, who shook the Duke's hand, and then looked at Flora with the expression of a man who knew perfectly well which of the two had solved his problem. She showed him the kitchen garden, where Bro had expanded the herb beds at her suggestion, and the still room, which was now stocked and organized and smelled of lavender and dried rosemary. At the end of the walk, they stood at the edge of the park, looking back at the house. The morning light was warm on the stone facade. The front doors were open. Smoke rose from the chimneys, all of them drawing cleanly. "You have done something remarkable," Benedict said. "I have done what needed doing." "That is what makes it remarkable." She looked at him then, not with triumph, not with vindication, but with the steady, practical warmth of a woman who had always known what she was capable of and had simply been waiting for someone else to notice. He did not kiss her. He was not yet that kind of husband. But he offered her his arm for the walk back to the house, and she took it, and they walked together through the front door of Ashwick Hall as though they had been doing it for years. Benedict began dining with Flora every evening. He began joining her in the morning room after breakfast, where he read his correspondence while she reviewed the household accounts. He began asking her opinion on estate matters, tentatively at first, then with increasing frequency, then with the unself-conscious regularity of a man who has discovered that the most capable person in his household has been sitting in his morning room since February. In June, he had her room moved, not to a larger room, to the Duchess's chambers, adjacent to his own, which had been closed since his mother's death. Flora did not remark upon it. She unpacked her 2 trunks and her hat box and arranged her spectacles on the writing desk by the window, and when Mrs. Selwyn came to help her settle in, Flora asked if the chimney in this room drew well. "Perfectly, Your Grace," Mrs. Selwyn said, and the title, Your Grace, settled between them like something that had always been true and was only now being spoken aloud. In September, Cavender submitted his quarterly report to the Duke. It was the first quarterly report in 11 years that included a separate section headed Household Improvements under the direction of the Duchess. The section ran to 3 pages. Benedict read it in his study, alone, and then sat for a long time looking at the snowdrops, fresh ones now, replaced by Flora weekly, on his windowsill. The following spring, Flora bore a daughter. They named her Marion, after Flora's mother. Benedict held the child in his study, in the chair where he had once told his steward that his wife would not last a month, and felt the weight of her, the literal weight, the astonishing smallness, and understood that the prediction had not merely been wrong. It had been the most consequential miscalculation of his life. Years later, many years after Marion had grown into a girl who asked the same direct questions as her mother, and who could identify every tenant on the estate by name before she was 10, after a son named Thomas had arrived and learned to walk in the morning room where Flora still kept her spectacles and her accounts, after a second daughter, Louisa, had been born in the bedchamber that Flora had once stripped and remade with her own hands, Cavender retired. He was 63. His knees troubled him on wet mornings, and his eyesight was not what it had been, though his memory remained precise and his loyalty absolute. He had served the Ashwick estate for 27 years, the last 16 of which he had served, in practical terms, two masters, the Duke and the Duchess, though he would have said, if pressed, and Cavender was not a man who was often pressed, that the Duchess had been the easier to serve because she always knew what she wanted done, and she always explained why. The household gathered in the servants' hall for his farewell. Mrs. Selwyn, who had retired 2 years earlier but had come back for the occasion, wept openly. Nan, who never wept, produced a cake of such architectural ambition that it required 2 footmen to carry it to the table. Brough, who had never been known to attend an indoor event voluntarily, stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands and nodded once, which from Brough was the equivalent of a standing ovation. Benedict wrote his letter of commendation personally. It was 3 sentences long, because Benedict remained a man of few words, but the final sentence read, "You served this house faithfully, and you had the good sense to recognize its true authority before I did." Cavender framed the letter. He hung it in the cottage on the estate grounds that Benedict had given him, rent-free for the remainder of his life, a cottage whose chimney drew cleanly, whose drainage was sound, and whose garden grew radishes every spring. Flora found the letter years after Cavender's retirement, during one of her visits to his cottage with a jar of Nan's preserves. She read it without comment. She put it back on the wall. She walked home through the grounds of Ashwick Hall, past the home farm with its rebuilt roof, past Mr. Goss's lower pasture that no longer flooded, past the kitchen garden where Nan still grew thyme. And she felt, as she often did on these walks, the particular satisfaction of a woman who had been underestimated and had responded not with proof, but with presence. She had never known what Benedict said to Cavender that morning in February. She did not need to know. The words existed only in the space between 2 men who had both, in their different ways, been wrong about her, and who had both, in their different ways, spent the rest of their lives being grateful for the error. Ashwick Hall stood in the late afternoon light, its chimneys drawing cleanly, its doors open, its windows bright. Inside, Marian was arguing with Thomas about the Latin word for radish. Mrs. Selwyn's niece, who had taken over as housekeeper when Mrs. Selwyn retired to live with Nan in the village, was preparing tea. Benedict was in his study, reading, though he would come to the morning room soon, because he always came to the morning room eventually. Flora sat at her desk. She put on her spectacles. She opened the household accounts. The house was running. They arrive here, like a tenant at the door of the great house, not demanding entry, simply standing until someone with sense opens it, and they are always welcome whenever they are ready.